My name is Ethan Hayes. I'm 52 years old now, but this happened back when I was 48. Before this, I spent 20 years in the Army, most of it with the 75th Ranger Regiment. When I retired, I came back home to the rolling, wooded hills of southeastern Ohio. It was the only place that ever felt right. I'd spent my whole life in the woods, first as a boy learning from my grandfather, then as a soldier learning to use them as cover and concealment. I thought I knew their every sound, every shadow, every secret. I made a living as a wildlife photographer, which was really just an excuse to stay out there, where the world made sense. I knew the difference between a deer's snap of a twig and a coyote's stealthy tread. I could tell a black bear's territorial markings from the scrape of a buck's antlers. I was comfortable in that world. I was competent. I was wrong.
The property was 160 acres of dense hardwood forest that had been in my family for 3 generations, bordering a massive, untamed section of the Wayne National Forest. At its center, nestled in a shallow valley, was a small, rustic cabin my grandfather built with his own 2 hands. It was my sanctuary. No electricity, no running water, just a wood stove, a well pump, and silence. In mid-October of that year, I went up for a long weekend with my best friend, Jake Miller. Jake and I had served together. He was a rock, steady and calm, the kind of man you want next to you when things go sideways. With us was his cousin, Brian. Brian was 22, full of the kind of confidence that only comes from never having been truly tested. He was a good kid, but loud. He treated the woods like an amusement park, a place to conquer with loud music and louder jokes. He didn't understand its quiet language. We got there on a Friday afternoon. The air was crisp, holding the smell of wood smoke and decaying leaves. The colors were incredible that year, a riot of deep reds and blazing oranges painted across the hills. We unpacked the truck, hauling gear and coolers into the cabin. Brian immediately cranked up a portable speaker, and some grating pop music echoed through the valley. Jake shot him a look, and Brian, to his credit, turned it down. The plan was simple: spend the weekend scouting for deer season, enjoying the fall, and I was hoping to get some good shots of the foliage and maybe a trophy buck if I got lucky. It was a routine we'd followed a dozen times before. It felt normal. It felt safe. The first evening was perfect. We sat on the porch as dusk settled, drinking beer and watching the deep blue shadows creep up the sides of the valley. The forest began its nightly symphony, the chirping of crickets, the distant hoot of a barred owl, the rustle of small things in the dry leaves.
It was a sound I knew better than my own heartbeat. But as full darkness fell, something changed. It started with a silence. Not a gradual quieting, but a sudden, clipped stop. The crickets went dead. The owls went mute. It was as if someone had thrown a switch, plunging the entire valley into an unnatural, profound silence. The only sound left was the crackle of our small campfire. Jake noticed it too. He lowered his bottle and scanned the tree line, his posture shifting from relaxed to alert. "You hear that?" he murmured. "Hear what?" Brian asked, oblivious. "Exactly," Jake said. "Nothing." I felt it too, a prickling on the back of my neck, the kind of instinctual warning that evolution had hardwired into our DNA, the feeling of being watched. We sat there for a long moment, listening to the nothingness. It was heavier than any sound, a weighted, expectant silence that felt like a predator was holding its breath. Then we heard it. A single, heavy snap. It came from the dense thicket on the ridge to our west, maybe 100 yards out. It wasn't the sound of a deer stepping on a branch. This was the sound of a 2-inch thick limb being broken cleanly in two. The sound was sharp, loud, and deliberate. A bear, maybe, I told myself. A big one. But bears are noisy in a clumsy, shuffling way. This was different. It was singular, powerful, controlled.
We waited, but there was no follow-up sound. No rustling, no grunting, just that one violent crack, and then the oppressive silence rushing back in. Brian laughed nervously. "Probably just Bigfoot," he joked, trying to break the tension. "Heard he's got a timeshare out here." Jake didn't smile. He just kept his eyes on the dark wall of trees. "Let's call it a night," I said, my voice sounding flatter than I intended. The comfortable feeling of the evening was gone, replaced by a low-grade hum of anxiety. We doused the fire, the hissing steam sounding unnervingly loud in the dead air, and went inside, locking the heavy oak door behind us. That night, I slept fitfully, my rifle on the cot next to me. I kept waking up, listening to the silence, feeling like it was listening back. The next morning, the sun rose into a clear, cold sky. The forest was alive again with the chatter of squirrels and the calls of blue jays. The oppressive atmosphere of the night before had lifted, and in the bright light of day, it was easy to dismiss it. We made breakfast, the smell of bacon and coffee filling the small cabin. Brian was back to his usual self, joking about how we were spooked by a squirrel. Jake and I let him talk. We knew what we had felt. After breakfast, I decided to check a game camera I had set up a week prior on a trail about a half-mile from the cabin. I was hoping to see what kind of deer were moving through the area. The camera was a heavy-duty model, designed to be weatherproof and bear-resistant. I had mounted it about 10 feet up a thick maple tree, angled down at the trail. It was secured with a python lock, a thick, braided steel cable. When I got to the spot, my stomach tightened. The camera was gone. I looked around thinking maybe an animal had somehow knocked it loose. I found it about 20 feet away, lying in the leaves. It was smashed. The casing was cracked open, the lens shattered. It looked like it had been slammed against the tree with incredible force. But that wasn't the worst part. The python lock cable was still wrapped around the tree. It hadn't been cut. It had been stretched and torn apart, the braided steel wires frayed and broken like cheap string. I've seen what bears can do. They can bend steel, but I'd never seen one tear a cable like this. And the SD card, the small memory card that held all the pictures, was missing. The camera had been deliberately destroyed, and the evidence taken. A person, I thought. It had to be. Some local vandal or a poacher who didn't want his picture taken. It was a disturbing thought, but it was a human thought. It was an explanation I could understand. It was far more comforting than the alternative that was beginning to form in the back of my mind. I took the broken camera back to the cabin. When I showed it to Jake, his face hardened. He ran his thumb over the frayed ends of the steel cable. "No bear did this," he said quietly. "And no man I know could tear this cable with his bare hands." Brian, for the first time, looked genuinely uneasy. The swagger was gone. "So what then?" he asked, his voice small. I didn't have an answer. We spent the rest of the day close to the cabin. The easygoing mood of the trip completely evaporated. We chopped wood, cleaned our rifles, and spoke in low tones. Every gust of wind in the trees made us flinch. We were on edge, our military training kicking in, scanning our sectors, treating the familiar forest like hostile territory. As dusk fell, we didn't light a fire. We ate a cold meal inside the cabin and shuttered the windows. The silence descended again, just as it had the night before. It felt even more menacing this time. We knew something was out there. We sat in the dark, the only light coming from a single kerosene lamp turned down low, casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. Jake sat in a chair facing the door, his 12-gauge pump shotgun across his lap. I took the window, my .30-06 hunting rifle resting on the sill. Brian sat on his cot, trying to look tough, but his knuckles were white where he gripped a small hatchet. The first sound came around 10 o'clock, a soft, scraping noise against the west wall of the cabin, the same direction we'd heard the branch snap. It sounded like thick claws being dragged slowly down the rough-hewn logs.
Scrape, scrape, scrape. It was slow, deliberate, exploratory. My heart hammered against my ribs. I motioned for Jake to stay put and crept toward the wall, pressing my ear against the wood. I could hear something on the other side. A low, wet, snuffing sound, like a huge animal sniffing at the chinking between the logs. And then I heard it breathe. A deep, guttural inhale and a long, rattling exhale that vibrated through the wall. It was inches away from me. I recoiled from the wall, my own breath catching in my throat. The sheer proximity of it, the intimacy of that sound, was terrifying. I looked at Jake, my eyes wide. He nodded slowly, his face a grim mask in the lamplight. He had heard it too. The sniffing moved along the wall, toward the front of the cabin. It stopped at the door. We heard the heavy oak plank creak as something pushed against it. Not a frantic shove, but a steady, testing pressure. The door groaned, the iron hinges straining. Then, the brass doorknob began to turn. Slowly, deliberately, it jiggled back and forth. My mind reeled. A bear doesn't turn a doorknob. No animal I knew of did. This was intelligent. This was something trying to figure out how to get inside. Brian let out a small, choked gasp. Jake raised his shotgun, the muzzle pointed squarely at the center of the door. The turning stopped. There was a long pause. Then, a new sound. A low, deep-throated growl that seemed to come from the very bowels of the earth. It wasn't the growl of a bear or a dog. It was deeper, more resonant, filled with a terrifying, calculated malice. The sound seeped through the wood, through the floor, and into our bones. It was a sound of absolute dominance, a declaration that we were the intruders, and this was its house. The pressure on the door stopped. We heard heavy, shuffling footsteps moving away from the porch. For a moment, we allowed ourselves a flicker of hope. Maybe it was leaving. But the footsteps just circled around to the side of the cabin, to the one window we hadn't been able to fully shutter because the wood was warped. All we had managed was to wedge a piece of plywood over the lower half. The top half was just a pane of old, wavy glass. Brian was closest to that window. He had his back pressed against the opposite wall, his face pale. "Don't move," Jake whispered, the command sharp and clear. "Don't make a sound." We heard the same wet, snuffing sound right outside the window. Then, a long, black-nailed finger, thick as a sausage, curled over the top of the plywood board. It was followed by another and another, until a whole hand was visible, gripping the edge of the board. The hand wasn't animalistic. It was shaped like a human's, but it was oversized, covered in coarse black hair and tipped with thick, yellowed claws that looked like they could tear through steel. It pulled, and the plywood groaned, the nails holding it in place screeching as they were slowly ripped from the window frame. Brian broke. He let out a terrified yell and scrambled away from the window. At the same time, he fumbled for the powerful LED flashlight he always carried. He switched it on and pointed the beam directly at the window. It was a mistake. A terrible, terrible mistake. For one blinding second, the creature outside was illuminated. My mind struggled to process what I saw. It was huge, its head and shoulders filling the entire top half of the window frame. The head was purely, undeniably canine, like that of a monstrous German shepherd or a wolf, but with a horrifying intelligence burning in its eyes. They weren't animal eyes. They were a pale, sickly yellow, and they glowed with a faint, internal light. They were staring right at Brian. Its fur was a matted, greasy black, and its shoulders were impossibly broad, wider than any man's. The sheer bulk of it was staggering. It was hunched over to look in the window, and even then it towered over the frame. The face was a nightmare mask of snarling lips pulled back to reveal long, yellow canines. But the most horrifying part was the brief, clear glimpse I got of its posture. It was standing on 2 legs. The light seemed to enrage it. It let out a deafening roar, a sound that was part wolf's howl and part lion's roar, a sound that shattered the night and seemed to shake the very foundations of the cabin. It smashed its fist, not a paw, a fist, against the window pane. The old glass exploded inward, showering the floor with glittering shards. That's when all hell broke loose. It was a siege. The creature, enraged, began to batter the cabin with a furious, relentless assault. It threw its massive weight against the walls, and the whole structure shuddered. We could hear it tearing at the logs with its claws, the sound of splintering wood filling the air. Jake and I went into autopilot, our training taking over. We started barricading. "The table, now!" I yelled, and we shoved the heavy oak dining table against the main door. We piled benches, chairs, anything with weight against it. Brian was frozen, huddled in a corner, shaking uncontrollably. The creature was intelligent. It wasn't just a mindless assault. It was systematic. It tested the door, then the shuttered windows, one by one, searching for a weak point. It moved with a terrifying speed and purpose. We heard it on the porch, then at the back of the cabin, then on the side again. It was circling us, probing our defenses. Then, from the woods, a new sound began. A high-pitched, piercing scream. It sounded exactly like a woman crying for help. "Help me! Oh God, somebody help me!" The voice was filled with terror and pain. Brian looked up, his eyes wide with confusion and horror. "There's someone out there! We have to help her!" "Stay down," Jake roared, his voice cutting through the chaos. "That's not a person." He was right. The mimicry was good, but it was too perfect, too theatrical. And underneath the feigned panic, there was a strange, guttural resonance. It was a trap, a lure. It was trying to draw us out. The screaming went on for a minute, then stopped abruptly, replaced by that deep, rumbling growl, as if the creature was amused by its own cruel trick. The assault on the cabin walls intensified. A massive blow struck the wall next to the broken window, and a log splintered, a long crack appearing in the wood. It was trying to break its way through. Then the sounds on the walls stopped. For a few seconds, there was silence again, an even more terrifying silence than before. "Where did it go?" Brian whispered, his voice trembling. "Roof," Jake breathed, and as he said it, we heard it, a heavy scraping sound directly above our heads. Thump, thump, thump. It was walking on the roof. The sheer weight of it made the rafters creak and groan. Dust and bits of dried moss rained down on us. It began tearing at the roof, trying to rip the shingles off. We could hear the sound of wood splintering, of nails being pulled from their perches. It was going to come through the ceiling. We were trapped. There was no way out. We were in a wooden box, and something from a primal nightmare was trying to peel it open. We huddled in the center of the room, our rifles pointed at the ceiling, waiting for the inevitable. The tearing sound was getting louder, more frantic. Any second now, a hole would appear, and that monstrous face would be looking down at us. This is where Brian completely lost his mind. His survival instinct, twisted by sheer terror, overrode all reason. He saw the barricaded door, the monster on the roof, and he made a choice. He saw one path to safety: the truck. It was parked 50 yards away, a metal box that represented civilization and escape. I'm getting out of here, he screamed, his voice cracking. Before we could stop him, he scrambled over the barricade we had built against the back door, a smaller, less reinforced door that led to the woodpile. Brian, no, wait, I yelled, but he wasn't listening. He fumbled with the bolt, threw the door open, and sprinted out into the darkness. The moment the door opened, the tearing sound on the roof stopped. In the sudden silence, we heard Brian's frantic footsteps on the dry leaves. He made it about 20 feet. From the side of the cabin, a massive, black shape moved with a speed that was impossible for something so large. It was a blur of motion. It didn't run. It flowed across the ground in long, loping strides, covering the distance to Brian in 2 seconds. We heard Brian let out a single, strangled cry, a sound that was cut off with a wet, sickening crunch. Jake and I stood frozen at the open doorway, horrified. In the dim moonlight, we saw the creature standing over Brian's body. It had him by the throat, holding him effortlessly off the ground. It shook him once, like a dog with a rat, and his neck snapped with a sound like a pistol shot. Then it threw him aside and turned its glowing yellow eyes toward us, toward the open door. It had what it wanted, a way in, or maybe Brian's desperate act had just been a diversion, an opportunity. There was no time to think. Go, now, Jake screamed, shoving me toward the door. The creature was starting to move toward us. We didn't have time to re-barricade. Our only chance was to run. We burst out of the cabin, not toward the truck where Brian lay, but in the opposite direction, toward the dense woods and the old, overgrown logging road that was about a mile east. It was our only hope. We plunged into the dark forest, adrenaline and terror giving us a strength we didn't know we had. We ran blindly, crashing through underbrush, branches whipping at our faces. Behind us, we heard it give chase. It wasn't just running. It was crashing through the forest like a bulldozer, snapping saplings in its path, letting out furious, guttural roars that echoed through the hills. It was gaining on us. The sound of its heavy footfalls was getting closer, punctuated by the cracking of wood. We were running for our lives, our lungs burning, our legs screaming. I risked a glance over my shoulder. I could see it, a towering silhouette against the faint starlight, weaving through the trees with an unnatural grace and speed. Its long arms swung as it ran, and I could hear its deep, ragged breaths. Jake was slightly ahead of me. He stopped, turned, and raised his shotgun. "Keep running," he yelled. He fired a round of buckshot into the darkness. The roar of the gun was deafening. It was followed by a howl of pain and rage from the creature. The shot must have connected. The crashing sound behind us faltered for a moment. It bought us a few precious seconds. We kept running, scrambling up a steep, muddy embankment. My foot slipped and I went down hard, my rifle flying from my hands. My knee exploded in pain. I cried out as I tried to get up, but a sharp, stabbing pain shot up my leg. I couldn't put any weight on it. Jake was there in a second, hauling me to my feet. "I can't," I gasped, the pain making me dizzy. My legs busted. "You can and you will," he said, his voice hard as iron. He slung my arm over his shoulder and half dragged, half carried me forward. The creature was coming again, angrier than before. Its roars were closer, more frequent. We were losing ground. I fumbled for my sidearm, a .45 I always carried in the woods. I fired twice behind us, aiming at the sound, not even sure if I was hitting anything. We stumbled on, Jake bearing most of my weight. He was a hero. He could have left me. He could have saved himself. But he didn't. We were brothers, and you don't leave a brother behind. We could see a faint lightening of the sky through the trees to the east. Dawn was coming. Maybe, just maybe, if we could make it to daylight. The logging road was just ahead. We could see the faint straight line of it through the trees. 50 more yards. 40. The creature was almost on top of us. I could smell it now, a rank, musky odor like wet dog, carrion, and damp earth. It was a primal stench of predator and decay. We burst out of the tree line and onto the gravel road just as the first rays of the sun crested the ridge. We collapsed onto the road, gasping for air, completely spent. We turned to face our pursuer, ready to make our last stand. But it wasn't there. It had stopped at the edge of the woods, a dark, hulking shape partially obscured by the trees. It stood there, watching us, its yellow eyes burning with hate. The new sunlight seemed to bother it.
It shielded its eyes with one of its long arms, and with one last, frustrated snarl, it melted back into the shadows of the forest. We lay on the road for what felt like an eternity, our bodies shaking, our minds shattered. We were alive. We had survived. A few minutes later, we heard the rumble of an engine. An old logging truck came around the bend, its headlights still on in the early morning gloom. The driver, a grizzled old man with a face like a road map, slammed on his brakes, his eyes wide as saucers at the sight of us. We were a mess, covered in mud and blood, our clothes torn to shreds. Jake had a long, deep gash on his forearm from a branch, and my knee was already swelling to the size of a grapefruit. We just pointed back the way we came and stammered one word: help. He got us into his truck and drove us straight to the sheriff's office in the nearest town. We were in shock, rambling, trying to piece together the night's events into a coherent story.
We told them everything. The silence, the broken camera, the siege on the cabin, the mimicry, the creature. We told them about Brian. The dispatcher called for an ambulance for me and Jake, and the sheriff, a man named Patterson with tired eyes and a skeptical frown, took our initial statements. He listened patiently, but I could see the disbelief in his face. He kept asking if we had been drinking or using drugs. He sent a couple of deputies up to the cabin. They found it, of course. The place was a wreck. The door was torn from its hinges, the window was shattered, and there were deep gouge marks all over the walls. There were splinters from the roof scattered on the floor inside. They found Brian's body not far from the porch. The official report, the one that came out a week later, was concise and dismissive. Brian Hayes, it said, was killed in a tragic animal attack. The coroner determined the cause of death to be a broken neck and multiple lacerations consistent with the claws and teeth of a large black bear. An unusually large and aggressive one, they added, as if that explained everything. Our story was written off as the hysterical ramblings of two traumatized men. The damage to the cabin? The bear trying to get at the food inside. The torn steel cable on the game camera? A faulty piece of equipment. Our gunshot wounds were self-inflicted in the panic. They found the shotgun shells in the .45 casings, and the narrative they built was that we had been spooked by a bear, started shooting wildly in the dark, and in the ensuing chaos, Brian had run out of the cabin and been mauled. It was a neat, tidy story that fit into their understanding of the world. It was a complete and utter lie. We argued, we pleaded, we showed them the impossibility of it. No bear turns a doorknob. No bear tears a roof apart from the top down. No bear systematically hunts a group of armed men. They just nodded, gave us pamphlets for grief counseling, and told us we were lucky to be alive. They put out a warning for a problem bear in the area, and a week later, they shot some poor, oversized black bear 5 miles from our property and declared the case closed. The public was safe again. We were left alone with the truth, isolated in a nightmare that no one else could see. About a month after the incident, I was back in town getting my knee checked out. An old deputy, a man named Roberts, who was just a few weeks from retirement, saw me in the hallway of the clinic. He pulled me aside into an empty waiting room. He looked around to make sure no one was listening. "Son," he said, his voice low and gravelly, "I read your statement, all of it. I believe you." I was so stunned I couldn't speak. He went on.
I've been a deputy in these hills for 40 years. You see things that don't make the papers. Back in '88, a whole family of campers vanished from a site not 10 miles from your family's land. Found their tent shredded, but never found them. In '95, 2 hunters were found, torn to pieces. Another bear attack. I've seen tracks that don't belong to any animal in any book. Tracks like a giant wolf walking on its hind legs. He looked me dead in the eye, his gaze heavy with decades of unspoken knowledge. Whatever you saw out there, it's been here a long, long time. It's smart and it's patient. Patterson is a good sheriff, but he's a politician. He can't have monsters running around in his county. It's bad for tourism. So, it becomes a bear. It always becomes a bear. He put a hand on my shoulder. Take my advice. Sell that land. And never, ever go back into those woods after dark. Some things are best left alone. He nodded once, then walked away,
leaving me standing there with the cold, terrifying validation I had been so desperate for. It was worse than the disbelief. It meant it was all real. That was 4 years ago. I sold the property. I couldn't bear the thought of ever setting foot on it again. My grandfather's cabin, my sanctuary, is probably collapsing back into the earth by now, and that's fine by me. I don't take pictures in the woods anymore. I can't. I can't stand the silence, and I can't stand the sounds. Every snap of a twig sends a jolt of ice through my veins. Every shadow seems to hold a pair of glowing yellow eyes. The thing that I loved, the thing that defined my life, was taken from me. Jake and I don't talk much anymore. We tried for a while, but the trauma was a wall between us. We were the only 2 people on earth who knew the truth of what happened that night, and looking at him was like looking in a mirror that reflected all the horror. He moved to Arizona a couple of years ago, said he needed to be somewhere with fewer trees, where he could see for miles. I don't blame him. I live in the city now. I hate it. I hate the noise and the crowds and the concrete. But I hate the silence of the deep woods more. I still have nightmares. I see that canine face, the intelligent eyes, the impossible way it moved. I hear Brian's last choked scream. I wake up in a cold sweat, the smell of rot and wet fur in my nostrils. I carry the guilt of his death every single day. Maybe if I had been faster, if I had said something different, if I hadn't taken him out there in the first place. Survivor's guilt is a poison with no antidote. I don't know why I'm telling this story. I don't expect you to believe me. Why would you? It sounds insane. But Deputy Roberts was right. It's always a bear, or a mountain lion, or a pack of coyotes. People need simple explanations for terrifying things. They need the world to make sense. But I know that it doesn't. I know that there are things living in the deep, dark places of the world that have been there since long before we built our towns and our roads. They are ancient, they are intelligent, and they are territorial. We trespass in their world, armed with our arrogance and our technology, thinking we are the masters of this planet. We are not. We are just noisy, fragile trespassers, and sometimes they remind us of that fact. So, if you ever find yourself deep in the woods, and the birds and the insects suddenly go silent, don't just stand there. Don't try to rationalize it. Run.